Hi, Big God family. It's Pastor Katie, and I wanted to share a book with you this week. Last Sunday in church, Pastor Helen started our Do Unto Others series, and we thought about kindness. And I have a great book that can help us all think about how we can be kind. It's called Enemy Pie by Derek Munson. I don't know if you've ever had an enemy, but let's see what happens. It should have been a perfect summer. My dad helped me build a treehouse in our backyard, and my sister was at camp for 3 whole weeks, and I was on the best baseball team in town. It should have been a perfect summer, but it wasn't. It was all good until Jeremy Ross moved into the neighborhood right next to my best friend Stanley. I did not like Jeremy Ross. He laughed at me and he struck me out on the baseball team. He had a party on his trampoline and I wasn't even invited, but my best friend Stanley was. Jeremy Ross was the one and only person on my enemy list. I never even had an enemy list until he moved into the neighborhood. But as soon as he came along, I needed one. I hung it up in my treehouse where Jeremy Ross was not allowed to go. Have you ever had an enemy? Ooh. Dad understood things like enemies. He told me that when he was my age, he had enemies too, but he knew a way to get rid of them. So I asked him how. I'll tell you how, I'll show you how, he said. He pulled out a really old recipe book on the kitchen shelf. Inside, there was a worn-out scrap of paper with folded writing. Dad held it up and he squinted at it. Enemy pie, he said, satisfied. You may be wondering what exactly is enemy pie. I was wondering too. But Dad had the recipe and it was so secret he couldn't even tell me. I decided it had to be magic. I begged him to tell me something, anything. I will tell you this, he said. Enemy pie is the fastest known way to get rid of your enemies. Now, of course, this got my mind working. What kinds of things, disgusting things, would I put in a pie for my enemy? I bought Dad some of the weeds from the garden, but he shook his head. I brought him some earthworms and rocks, but he didn't think he'd need those. I gave him the gum I've been chewing all morning, and he gave it right back to me. What gross things would you put in an enemy pie? I went out to play alone. I shot baskets until the ball got stuck on the roof, and I threw a boomerang that never came back. And all the while, I listened to the sounds of my dad chopping and stirring and blending the ingredients of enemy pie. This could be a great summer after all. Enemy pie was going to be awful. I tried to imagine how horrible it must smell, or worse yet, what it might look like. But when I was in the backyard looking for ladybugs, I smelled something really, really, really good. And as far as I could tell, it was coming from our kitchen. And I was a bit confused. I went to ask Dad what was wrong. Enemy pie shouldn't smell this good, but Dad was smart. He said if enemy pie smelled bad, your enemy would never eat it. I could tell I had never made an enemy pie before. Buzzer rang and Dad put on the oven mitts and pulled it out and put it in the oven. It looked like a plain old pie to me. It looked good enough to eat. I was catching on. But still, I wasn't really sure how this enemy pie worked. What exactly did it do to the enemies? Maybe it made their hair fall out or their breath stinky. Maybe it made bullies cry. I asked Dad, but he was absolutely no help. He would tell me not a thing. But while the pie cooled, he filled me in on my job. He said quietly, "This is one part of the enemy pie that I can't do. In order for it to work, you need to spend the day with your enemy. Even worse, you have to be nice to him, and it's not easy. But that's the only way that enemy pie can work. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" Of course I was. It sounded horrible. It was scary, but it was worth a try. All I had to do was spend one day with Jeremy Ross, and he'd be out of my hair for the rest of my life. So I rode my bike to his house, and I knocked on his door. When Jeremy opened the door, he seemed surprised. He stood on the other side of the screen door and looked at me, waiting for me to say something. I was nervous. "Can you play?" I asked. He looked confused. "I'll go ask my mom," he said, and he came back with shoes in his hand as Mom came around the corner to say hello. "You boys stay out of trouble," she said, smiling. We rode bikes for a while and played on the trampoline. Then we made some water balloons and threw them at the neighborhood girls, but we missed. Jeremy's mom made us lunch, and after lunch, we went over to my house. It was strange. I was kind of having a good time with my enemy. He almost seemed nice, but of course I couldn't tell Dad since he had worked so hard on this enemy pie. Jeremy Ross liked my basketball hoop. He said he wished he had a basketball hoop, but they didn't have room for one. I let him win a game, just to be nice. Jeremy Ross knew how to throw a boomerang. He threw it and it came right back to him. I threw it and went over my house into the backyard. When we climbed the fence, the first thing Jeremy noticed was my tree house. My treehouse was my treehouse. I was the boss. If my sister wanted in, I didn't have to let her. If my dad wanted in, I didn't have to let him. And if Jeremy Ross wanted to let him in, can we go in, he asked. I know he was going to ask me that, but he was on the top person, my only person on my enemy list. And enemies aren't allowed in my treehouse. But he did teach me how to throw a boomerang. And he did have me over for lunch. And he did let me play on his trampoline. He wasn't being a very good enemy. Okay, I said, but hold on. I climbed up ahead of him and tore down the enemy list, and I had a checkerboard and some cards in the treehouse. We played all games until Dad called us down for dinner. We pretended we didn't hear him, and when he came out to get us, we tried to hide from him, but soon he found us. Dad made macaroni and cheese for dinner, my favorite. It was Jeremy's favorite, too. Maybe Jeremy Ross wasn't so bad after all. I was beginning to think that maybe we should just forget this whole enemy pie thing. But soon enough, after dinner, Dad brought out the pie. I watched as he cut it into 8 pieces. Dad, I said, it sure is nice having a new friend in the neighborhood. I was trying to get his attention. I was trying to tell him that Jeremy Ross was no longer my enemy, but Dad only smiled and nodded. I think he thought I was pretending. Dad dished up 3 plates, side by side, with big pieces of pie and giant scoops of ice cream. He passed one to me and one to Jeremy. Wow, Jeremy said, my dad never makes pies like this. It was at this point I panicked. I didn't want Jeremy to eat enemy pie. He was my friend now. I couldn't let him eat it. Jeremy, don't eat this. It's bad pie, I said. I think it's got poison or something. Jeremy's fork stopped before reaching his mouth. He crumpled his eyebrows and looked at me funny, and I felt relieved. I'd saved his life. I was a hero. If it's so bad, Jeremy said, then why is your dad eating half of it? And I looked at my dad, and sure enough, he was eating enemy pie. Good stuff, he mumbled. And that was all he said. I sat there watching them eat enemy pie for a few seconds, and Dad laughing and Jeremy happily eating. Neither of them was losing their hair. It seemed safe enough, so I took a tiny taste, and enemy pie was delicious. After dessert, Jeremy rode his bike home, but not before inviting me over to play on his trampoline in the morning. He said he would teach me how to flip. As for enemy pie, I still don't know how to make it. I still wonder if enemies really do hate it, or if their hair falls out, or if their breath turns bad. I don't know, and I'll never get an answer, because I just lost my enemy. Enemy Pie by Derek Munson. What a great book for us this week as we think about kindness. And while it's not always true that when we are kind to our enemies, they become our friends, leading with kindness is one of the ways that we can share God's love and grace in a community, in our schools, in our jobs, in our homes, in our neighborhood, as we live together, as we do unto others. This week, I hope you guys will be blessed.